I was born with a cursed mouth, and I was the unluckiest baseborn daughter of Northcott Hall. When I was 7, my older half-sister stole my only winter coat, and I cried that all 10 of her fingers would rot with frost. The next day she fell through the lake ice, and every one of those 10 fingers festered. When I was 13, my stepmother locked me in the woodshed with no food or water. I muttered that she'd see blood before sunset, and half an hour later a panicked stallion broke her ribs. After that, everyone in Northcott Hall called me a calamity. My father said I poisoned the house just by standing in it. My stepmother accused me of killing my grandmother and dumped me in a pauper's burial field. I lived on bark and roots, and all I wanted was to carry my mother's ashes home to the Veyra Highlands. I'd barely reached the city gate when Beatrice arrived with crown guards and blocked my path. The Dowager Queen has ordered a noblewoman chosen to be buried with the Emperor. If Northcott Hall gives up a daughter, the whole family is honored. You're an embarrassment alive. At least your death can bring this house some glory. My father took the payment with his own hands and ordered the servants to nail me into the coffin. What they didn't know was that the Emperor wasn't dead at all. A few days earlier, at a palace banquet, I'd seen him standing in the winter wind and said, "Dress that lightly, His Majesty may stop breathing from the cold tonight." Before dawn, the palace announced the Emperor had no pulse. I kicked the coffin lid open, looked around at a burial chamber full of royal treasure, and smiled. "Your Majesty, I've come to lift your curse." When I kicked open the coffin lid, the mausoleum steward tumbled down the steps in terror. White mourning banners twisted in the wind, and mourning papers scattered across the chamber. Someone screamed, "The dead woman's moving." Half my body was still trapped inside the coffin, and an iron shackle around my ankle had been bolted to the bottom. Northcott Hall had been determined to make certain I died. Even their burial sacrifice came with a lock. Fresh scratches marked the inside wall of the coffin. Beatrice had carved them. "Calamities belong underground, rotting forever." I laughed once. The coffin nails had already torn my palm open. The mausoleum steward had nearly lost his senses. "Hold her down. Don't let that filthy thing near His Majesty." 2 young attendants rushed me, but I caught the coffin edge and dragged myself free. In the central sarcophagus, Emperor Cassian Thornfield's face had turned gray, yet his chest still moved faintly. An elderly palace steward hurried over and planted his boot on the back of my hand. A sacrificial girl sent by Northcott Hall dares touch the Emperor? My fingernails bent backward beneath his heel, and pain darkened my vision. He spat beside me. "With a fate like yours, even your corpse pollutes the royal tomb." I looked up and smiled coldly. "If your eyes are useless, have them cut out. Delay any longer and blood will start leaking from every opening in his face." The instant I finished speaking, 2 trails of black blood appeared beneath Cassian's nose. A junior attendant dropped to his knees. "Steward Bram, His Majesty's bleeding." Bram's expression changed. He pointed at me and started shouting, "Calamity. Her curse has woken up. Beat her to death. Now." The other women chosen for the burial huddled in a corner and sobbed. "Don't drag us into this. She's Northcott Hall's cursed daughter. Kill her." Guards forced me to the floor, and my forehead struck the stone tiles. Northcott's cast off. Even dead, she'd stain the mausoleum. I bit through my lip but refused to shed a tear. All through childhood, tears at Northcott Hall had earned only harder blows. My mother's ashes were still in that house. If I died here, even her remains would have nowhere to rest. I raised my voice and screamed, "The incense burner is poisoned." I jerked my chin toward the bronze vessel in the center of the chamber. "Let it burn another few minutes, and every living person in this room goes down." Bram was about to order someone to gag me when a young attendant suddenly clutched his throat and fell, his face turning purple. Every insult in the room stopped. Bram stepped backward, and I used the confusion to crawl to the burner and scrape aside the ash. A layer of Verandatura powder had been hidden beneath it. The room had smelled exactly like this when my mother died. My father had stood outside her door then, unwilling even to touch her forehead because he thought she was unlucky. I pulled a silver burial pin from my hair and cut Cassian's fingertip. Blackened blood welled from the wound at once. "Bring cold water, coarse salt, and clean needles. Hurry." Everyone stared without moving. "Or bring nothing. When the Emperor really dies, every one of you can follow him down for real." That threat worked better than anything else. A basin arrived quickly, followed by needles. I drew off more than half a bowl of poisoned blood before a trace of living color returned to Cassian's face. His eyes opened slowly. "Who sent you?" Before I could answer, a shrill proclamation sounded beyond Hollow Crest Mausoleum. "By order of the Dowager Queen, His Majesty has entered final rest." Seal the coffins and begin burial at once. No one may reopen or inspect them. I drew breath to shout. Cashin's hand closed suddenly around my wrist from inside the sarcophagus. Keep playing dead. I want to see who's most desperate to bury me. I lowered my eyes. Blood still ran from the iron wound around my ankle. Northcott Hall wanted me dead. The Dowager Queen wanted him dead. Whether I saved the Emperor or not, no one meant to let me survive the night. Cashin saw that I hadn't moved and warned me again. Quick. Get back in the sacrifice coffin. I nearly cursed him aloud and wished him a miserable death. Before I could, he pressed half of a crest-marked medallion into my palm. Survive tonight. Whatever Northcott Hall owes you in blood, I'll collect it for you myself. He coughed, and black blood stained the corner of his mouth. Whatever they owe you, I'll collect. I'd heard too many beautiful promises inside that family. My father always said he'd buy me new clothes once my stepmother calmed down. Moira always promised that if I admitted fault, she'd let me out of the shed and feed me. Beatrice had sworn more than once that sisters could never truly harm each other. But trusting Cashin was the only path out alive. Your Majesty had better keep his word. The moment I lay back inside the coffin, someone outside started pouring powdered lime through the gaps. I didn't dare cough. I covered my mouth and nose with both hands. Tears, blood, and bitter lime ran together down my throat. Chaotic footsteps filled the outer passage. The Dowager Queen's agents had entered the mausoleum. The officer leading them went straight to the central sarcophagus, saw that the lid hadn't been nailed shut, and turned toward mine. Inspect the sacrifice first. Through the wood, I heard the men talking. Lord Northcott took 3,000 silver crowns from the Dowager Queen. He sold this cursed daughter, without blinking. Lady Northcott slipped us an extra purse too, with instructions. If the wretch isn't fully dead, finish her before she can crawl home and spoil Lady Beatrice's luck. My whole body started shaking beyond my control. 3,000 crowns. That was the price my father took to nail me into a coffin. Hands that greedy should rot before they hold another coin. The instant I spoke, a scream erupted outside. My hand. What's happening to my hand? The officer stopped lifting the burial cloth. Dark blisters spread across the back of his hand and started breaking open. Everyone retreated in panic. The dead woman's spite is on us. Cashin used the moment to cough a mouthful of black blood inside the neighboring sarcophagus. He sounded like something crawling up out of a grave to take a life with it. The Dowager Queen's guards stepped back. The officer clutched his hand and forced out an order. Seal the mausoleum. Her Majesty commands that the living and the dead stay inside. The hammering carried me back to the steps of Northcott Hall, where Beatrice had bent toward my coffin and smiled. Don't be afraid, Alara. It's dark in there, I know, but that's better than having you where I can see you. My arms and legs were going numb. I couldn't let myself be trapped and smothered again. I searched the coffin floor and found a short ceremonial knife among the burial goods. I cut through the ropes binding my wrists and ankles. Cashin didn't move. He pressed a raised stone set into the base of his sarcophagus. A thunderous grinding came from the deepest burial passage, and dust fell from the ceiling. The vaults are collapsing. Run. The guards forgot the burial order and fled for their lives. Hollowcrest Mausoleum fell silent again. I dragged in breath after breath and believed we'd escaped. Cashin sat up in the central coffin and wiped the blood from his lips. Tomorrow morning, the Dowager Queen will announce my death before the Crown Council. Every guard in Stone Harbor will be ordered to search for our bodies. Cold sweat covered my back. What happens if Northcott Hall catches me first? Cashin looked at me. I'll save you. Cashin's personal guard, Tobias Vance, hid me inside a side chamber of Hollowcrest Mausoleum. Only after I'd stripped off the burial dress did I realize the cloth bundle I always carried was gone. It held the urn with my mother's ashes. I grabbed Tobias by the sleeve. Where are my mother's remains? He looked startled. You weren't carrying an urn when they brought you in. Northcott Hall must have kept it to keep a grip on me. I'd found a way out of the grave only to feel it close again. Every humiliation, every swallowed grief, lodged in my throat. I'd walk straight back into death before I left my mother in that house. Tobias blocked the doorway. Lady Alara, don't do anything reckless. I shoved him aside. Move. Before my mother died, she held my hand and made me promise to take her home to Veyra. Everything I've survived was for the chance to keep that promise. Conflict crossed his face. The city's crawling with the Dowager Queen's informants. Cashin coughed behind the curtain and came out, one hand braced against the doorframe. Tobias dropped to one knee. Your Majesty. Cashin didn't stop me. He handed me a bronze authority token. The charity morgue outside the eastern gate. Go. Then he added, Northcott Hall will be there to identify a body and collect the reward. I turned toward the exit. Cashin lifted one hand. Take 2 guards. Come back alive. A Northcott carriage stood outside the morgue. From behind a curtain, I heard Moira Northcott sobbing with extraordinary force. My poor Alara. She was baseborn, but I raised that girl with these 2 hands. Beatrice covered the corner of her mouth with an embroidered handkerchief. Don't grieve, mother. Alara's luck was cruel, but dying for the crown is an honor. Through the gap in the curtain, I saw a woman's body under a white cloth. My father, Cedric Northcott, stood nearby, wearing an expression of deep sorrow while his eyes kept sliding toward the reward ledger in a palace official's hands. Moira covered her nose and dropped her voice. The smell is unbearable. If I'd known, I'd have starved her a few days before we sent her off, so there'd be less filth in her. Cedric warned her quietly. Keep your voice down. Don't let the palace men hear you. Beatrice put out one polished shoe and kicked the covered corpse. She was a disaster alive, but at least she picked a useful time to die. Once the Dowager Queen pays out, I'll have a reason to enter the palace, mourning rites. Anger burned through me. Cry that falsely, and your painted face will split open. Moira screamed. Powder peeled off her cheeks, showing the raw, scratched rash underneath. Cedric recoiled and pointed at the corpse. The body's cursed. Get a priest. Bring salt and holy water. Moira scrambled behind him and pulled my mother's urn out of her sleeve. She held it over the burning brazier. Alara Northcott, I know your spirit's here. Show yourself, or there won't be a grain of your foreign mother left. Reason snapped. I threw the curtain aside and ran into the yard. Give me my mother. All 3 of them went white when they saw me alive. To cover her fear, Moira pitched her voice loud enough for the crowd. You cursed creature. You're still alive? You killed grandmother Adeline years ago, and now you've come back to destroy the rest of us. I looked at her and laughed coldly. Did I really kill Adeline? She was poisoned for months, with cinnabar stirred into her sleeping draught. The morgue examiner was standing right there. At those words, he stepped over to the older set of bones laid out on the ground. After a long inspection, his expression changed. These bones are darkened, and the residue in the joints matches long-term cinnabar poisoning. My father's first instinct wasn't to investigate his own mother's murder. His eyes went red as he waved the household guards forward. Shut that cursed girl's mouth before she spreads another lie. Northcott Hall didn't dare bring the city watch into it. My father swore I'd been staging tricks and had the household guards drag me home. They forced me to kneel outside the family shrine, the spot reserved for every beating and punishment of my childhood. Beatrice set my mother's urn beside a brazier. Admit your calamity, and admit you went to the royal tomb willingly. Then I might be generous enough to give this ugly jar back. She sent a maid to fetch the last winter coat my mother had sewn before she died. Remember this, Alara? You were 7, and you cursed me over this rag. It should have been burned years ago, but you guarded it like treasure. Moira gave the housekeeper, Winifred Doyle, a look. Hold her down. Make her bow to Lady Beatrice. Winifred pressed a hand to the back of my neck. Bow to your sister and thank her for keeping Northcott Hall's dignity. As my face neared the floor, I locked both arms and held. My father shouted, "Why haven't you admitted your fault yet?" I lifted my head. Blood ran from the corner of my mouth. What did I do wrong? Moira slammed the table and stood. Your mistake was being born worthless and refusing to stay obedient. Beatrice bent down and tossed the coat beside the brazier. Confess, and you get your mother's ashes. Sparks landed on the old fabric. I looked toward the memorial plaques on the shrine wall. Then let every Northcott ancestor hear it. This whole house is rotten enough to hold a dead woman's ashes over a fire to break the living. Dust came down from the shrine beam. One of the plaques crashed beside my father's boot, and he stumbled back in terror. Moira threw herself at him and started crying. Look at that, Cedric. The calamity came back to kill us all. Tie her up and hand her to the Dowager Queen for another reward. Beatrice knelt in front of my father. Yes, father. As the recognized daughter of Northcott Hall, I'm willing to enter the palace and lead the mourning rites for His Majesty. If I can get close to the Dowager Queen and the young prince she means to put on the throne, I can save this family. So that was her plan. She meant to climb into the palace by stepping over my coffin. To humiliate me, Beatrice changed into her mourning clothes while making me kneel out in the freezing corridor. Do you understand now, Alara? You only ever get into a coffin like a rat, while I walk through the palace gates in front of the whole court. I watched her roll the sealing clay she'd pried off my mother's urn between her fingers. Right in front of me, she ground it to powder under her shoe. I lunged for what was left of my mother. My father crossed the room and slapped me across the face. Why can't you show one fraction of your sister's sense? He didn't look at me again. He turned to lift Beatrice's long mourning train so it wouldn't touch the dust. I lay on the floor and laughed under my breath. If she touches the Emperor's coffin tonight, she'll be on her knees begging me to save her by morning. A palace attendant beside her whispered, "Lady Beatrice, the Dowager Queen says that if you keep all 3 nights of vigil, Northcott Hall will be shown extraordinary favor once the young prince takes the crown." Beatrice set her incense in the burner and rested a hand on the coffin lid. "He's really dead, isn't he?" Cashin's voice came from inside the coffin. "Beatrice, were you certain I was dead before you came to collect your reward?" The grand mourning pavilion of the inner palace had been draped in 3,000 yards of white silk, thick enough to muffle the sea wind blowing off. Stone harbor. Incense. Heavy, cloying, laced with bitter almond to disguise the scent of decay that should have filled the hall, rose in blue spirals toward the carved rafters. Beatrice Northcott's hand froze against the lacquered lid of the Imperial sarcophagus. Her skin, usually painted so pale with lead powder that she resembled a marble doll, turned the color of curdled milk. For 3 long heartbeats, the only sound was the snapping of the silk banners in the draft and the low, droning hum of 30 priests chanting the liturgy of the forgotten. Your Majesty?" Beatrice's voice broke into a thin, breathless squeak. Beside her, Dowager Queen Yvain's chief eunuch, Master Orson, dropped his gilded ceremonial bell. It struck the marble flagstones with a dull, sickening clang that rolled across the dais. "Did someone speak?" Orson whispered, his small eyes darting across the ranks of crown guards lining the walls. "Who whispered in the presence?" "Seize him." Beatrice tried to pull her hand away from the coffin. She could not. A pale, sinewy hand, its fingers calloused from 10 years of holding cavalry. Reins and broadswords shot out through the narrow gap between the lid and the casket wall. Iron-hard fingers locked around Beatrice's wrist with the force of a vice. "I ask you a question, Lady Beatrice," Cashin's voice rasped from the dark. "Interior." It was rough with salt and the residue of datura poison, but every syllable carried the weight of an executioner's blade. "You came into my house, accepted the dowager's silver, and trod upon my funeral shroud. Answer me, was your father so certain of my death that he sent his pride to mock my corpse?" Beatrice shrieked. It was not a lady's gentle swoon. It was the raw, animal scream of a hare caught in a snare. She thrashed backward, but Cashin did not let go. The force of her panic dragged her down onto her knees, her elaborate silk mourning train tearing across the iron studs of the bier. "Guards!" Orson yelled, his voice turning into an undignified howl. "Sorcery! The corpse has been possessed by a grave fiend. Drive iron through it. Drive iron into the box." 6 crown guards, their breastplates gleaming beneath white tabards, lowered their halberds and lunged toward the dais. They never reached the steps. From the shadowed galleries above the colonnade, crossbow strings sang in the dark. 6 steel-tipped bolts punched through the backs of the guards' necks in a single, synchronized thrum. The men collapsed without a groan, their blood fanning out across the polished white marble. A cold wind tore the heavy double doors of the pavilion wide open. Tobias Vance stepped over the threshold, followed by 40 men of the Iron Vanguard, men whose armor was not polished silver, but pitted black steel, bearing the clawmark crest of the Thornfield Kings. "The Emperor lives," Tobias roared, his broadsword clearing its sheath with a ring that set the brass urns vibrating. "And the palace gates are sealed under Imperial decree. Anyone who draws steel against the dais dies where he stands." Inside the coffin, Cashin pressed upward with both palms. The heavy oak lid, sealed with black wax and copper bands, splintered with the roar of a falling timber. It flew sideways, crashing down upon the silver offering table and smashing the jade bowls into 1,000 jagged shards. Cashin rose from the velvet lining like an idol carved from frost and iron. His linen burial tunic was torn, stained with black bile and dried salt around the neck, and his dark eyes burned with an icy, terrifying lucidity. He threw Beatrice to the floor at his feet, as if tossing aside a soiled rag. Beatrice curled against the base of the dais, weeping hysterically, her polished fingernails breaking as she clawed at the stone to drag herself away. "You?" Orson choked, retreating until his back hit the pillar. "Her Majesty, the Dowager Queen," she announced. She announced what she wished to be true, Cashin said quietly, descending the 3 marble steps. Each footstep was steady, measured, and dreadful. "She." bought my courtiers with Northcott grain, my doctors with foreign gold, and my council with empty titles. And she bought a daughter of Northcott Hall to rot beside me in hollow crest, so that no living voice could ever swear I breathed. He paused, looking down at Beatrice, whose face was buried in her ruined
sleeves.
Where is she?
Cashin asked.
Beatrice trembled so hard her teeth rattled together.
Who?
The girl your father sold for 3,000 crowns, Cashin said, his voice dropping into a register that made the hair on the back of Tobias's neck stand
up.
The sister whose coat you burned. The one who drew the venom from my veins while you were practicing your tears in the mirror. She's at the hall, Beatrice sobbed, terror driving every shred of cunning from her mind. Father locked her in the ancestral shrine. Mother said she would be strangled before sunrise, so the corpse wouldn't talk. Cashin's hand dropped to the hilt of Tobias's spare short sword. Tobias, the Emperor murmured. Sire, take 30 riders. Ride to Northcott Hall. Do not knock. Cashin's eyes were fixed on the dark horizon beyond the palace colonnade. Tear the gates off their hinges. If a single hair on that girl's head has been touched, hang Cedric Northcott from his own ancestral archway before I arrive. At Northcott Hall, the winter night was dying in an ugly, yellow fog. The ancestral shrine smelled of old tallow, damp brick, and burning fabric.
I
remained on my knees on the cold flagstones, my hands bound behind my back with hemp rope soaked in salt brine. Every breath scraped against my lungs like broken glass. The powdered lime from the mausoleum had scorched my throat, but the hatred in my chest kept the fire lit. Before me, on the iron brazier, the remnants of my mother's winter coat had dwindled to a heap of glowing gray cinders. On the carved rosewood altar above, my mother's urn sat surrounded by Northcott name tablets. The sealing wax Beatrice had scraped off lay scattered on the floor like dried scabs. Winifred Doyle, the head housekeeper who had beaten me with birch rods when I was 9 for dropping a silver spoon, stood over me holding a length of wet linen. Hold still, you wretched bastard, Winifred sneered, her breath sour with onion
soup.
Lord Northcott says there's to be no marks on the neck.
A wet cloth over.
The face does the work cleanly. Once your heart stops, we'll throw you in the lime pit behind the stables. No one will ever dig there. My father, Cedric Northcott, sat in the carved armchair beneath the portrait of our founder, sipping mulled wine from a silver goblet. He didn't look at me.
He
looked at the reward ledger, his thumb constantly stroking the inked seal of the Dowager Queen. Hurry it up, Winifred, Cedric said without looking up. The messenger from the palace should arrive before dawn to confirm Beatrice has been granted the title of mourning maiden. I won't have this house smelling of a fresh corpse when
Royal Carriage arrive.
My stepmother, Moira, was sitting near the charcoal heater, frantically rubbing cold cream onto her cheeks. But the skin beneath was blistering, red and cracked, where her cosmetic powder had peeled away in the morgue yard. Cut her tongue out first, Cedric. Moira spat, her voice thick with venom.
I
tell you, the girl has a devil in her mouth. She spoke, and my skin rotted.
She
looked at the examiner, and the old man found the cinnabar in Adeline's bones. If you leave her tongue intact, her ghost will curse our sons from the grave. Cedric frowned, a flicker of irritation crossing his brow. Wives shouldn't speak of ghosts. The grandmother died of old age. That matter is finished. Is it finished, father? I spoke. The words came from between my bloodied lips, low and clear, cutting through the crackle of the brazier. Winifred raised the wet linen to smother me, but I didn't flinch. I looked directly into my father's watery, greedy eyes. You took 3,000 crowns for my life, I whispered. You sold your own blood to buy Beatrice's seat at an empty throne. You think that gold will make your house great? Shut her mouth. Moira screamed, knocking her silver cream pot to the floor. Smother her. Winifred stepped forward and brought the wet cloth down toward my face. I looked Winifred dead in the eyes. Your arms have beaten motherless children for 20 years. Let them break like dry twigs before you lay another hand on
me.
The moment the last word fell from my tongue, Winifred gasped. A sharp, sickening crack echoed through the stone hall. Winifred's right wrist snapped backward at an impossible angle, the white splinter of a forearm bone bursting through her sleeve. She dropped the cloth, let out a high, ragged shriek, and collapsed, clutching her mangled arm against her ribs. Cedric leaped from his chair, spilling his mulled wine across the white fur rug. Demon, he roared, drawing a decorative short sword from the shrine wall.
You.
Baseborn bitch. I should have drowned you in the stable bucket the day that Veyra dropped you. Try it, I said, rising slowly to my feet despite the iron agony in my bound ankles. I leaned my back against the heavy altar leg, feeling the hemp rope rub against the sharp corner of the rosewood carving. With a savage jerk, I dragged the brine-soaked rope across the sharp brass corner until the fibers sheared and snapped. My hands came free. Cedric lunged at me, the steel blade trembling in his hand. He wasn't a soldier. He was a soft, cowardly courtier whose only talent was licking the boots of Imperial favorites. You want to kill me? I laughed, the sound hollow and sharp as a butcher's saw. Cedric Northcott, you loved gold more than your mother, your daughter, or your
Honor.
May every piece of silver you ever touched turn to molten lead in your throat. Cedric swung the blade at my shoulder.
Boom.
The heavy oak doors of the Northcott courtyard didn't open, they shattered. A battering ram of iron shod would splinter the entrance, and the roar of 30 armored men flooded the courtyard like a tidal wave. The stained glass windows of the ancestral shrine exploded inward in a hail of colored glass. Before Cedric could turn, a black feathered arrow smashed through his right shoulder, pinning him to the rosewood shrine behind him. The sword dropped from his fingers, clattering onto the flagstones. Cedric screamed, his hand clawing at the feathered shaft. Tobias Vance strode through the broken entrance, his broadsword dripping with the blood of the household guards who had been foolish enough to stand in the
Driveway.
Behind him, 2 Iron Vanguard soldiers kicked Veyra Northcott to the floor, their heavy boots pinning her face into the cold cinders of the brazier. Lady Alara, Tobias said, lowering his sword and bowing deeply from the waist. A full martial salute reserved only for commanders and royal consorts. I stood there, swaying on my wounded ankle, my hands covered in dried blood and
Lime.
Tobias, I rasped my throat raw. You took your time. His Majesty rode through the city gates himself. Tobias replied, his voice ringing through the ruined room. The Grand Council has been summoned. The Emperor requires your presence in the Great Hall of Stone Harbor. I didn't look at Cedric, who was sobbing and choking as blood soaked through his velvet doublet. I didn't look at Veyra, whose face was now truly blackened with charcoal and tears. I walked over to the altar. I picked up the simple, unglazed clay urn that held the only thing left of the woman who had sung me Veyran lullabies in the dark. I tucked it into the crook of my left arm, holding it against my ribs where my own heart beat. Then I looked down at Cedric Northcott. You called me a calamity, I said softly, as the soldiers bound him in iron
Chains.
You haven't seen the storm yet. The throne room of the Sunburst Palace was packed with 200 of the highest-ranking lords, dukes, and high priests of the realm. At the top of the 7 golden tiers sat Dowager Queen Yvain. She wore robes of deep imperial purple over morning white, her hair swept up into an elaborate wire cage studded with black pearls. Beside her, trembling like a leaf in an autumn gale, stood 11-year-old Prince Julian, the weak-chinned boy she intended to crown before the morning bells finished ringing. My lords, Yvain's voice echoed across the vaulted ceiling, smooth, sweet, and heavy with manufactured grief. Our beloved Emperor Cashin has fallen to a sudden, tragic pestilence. The gods have claimed his vigor, but the realm cannot stand empty while wolves gather at our borders. By royal testament I present your new sovereign. By whose testament? A voice sliced through the heavy air of the hall. The iron double doors of the throne room, doors that usually took 4 grown men to swing open, slammed outward until they struck the stone walls with the force of thunderclaps. Cashin stood in the arched portal. He wore no crown. He wore no silk. He wore his old battle armor, the black iron brigandine he had worn during the Highlands campaign, scarred by sword cuts and darkened by old blood. In his right hand, he carried no scepter. He held a bare, notched broadsword. Behind him walked 20 Iron Vanguard soldiers. And at his right side, walking step for step with her chin held high and a clay urn resting against her chest, walked the barefoot, blood-stained calamity of Northcott Hall. The silence that fell over the Grand Council was absolute. It was the silence of men who looked upon the dead walking under the morning sun. 3 older lords dropped their ceremonial staves. A high priest began, frantically making the warding sign of the sunburst across his chest. Cashin, Yvain whispered, rising from the queen's chair so fast that her Pearl headpiece rattled against the gilded canopy. Her carefully painted composure cracked, revealing the raw terror underneath. You were dead. The High Physician signed the death parchment. The High Physician took 10,000 gold crowns from your private treasury to brew Veyra de Tira, Cashin said, stepping down the central aisle. The lords and dukes parted before him like wheat before a scythe, throwing themselves to their knees on either side. He placed it in my wine, and when my pulse slowed, you ordered hollow crest sealed before my lungs even stopped moving. Treason! Yvain shrieked, pointing a shaking, gem-encrusted finger at him. This is an impostor. A sorcerer wearing the dead king's face. Crown guards.
Kill him.
Cut him down. Not a single guard moved. At the entrance to the hall, the captain of the Crown Guard lay dead in the corridor, and the remaining men had already dropped their spears, kneeling before the true emperor. And who helped you by the poison, stepmother? Cashin reached the base of the 7 golden tiers. He didn't look up at Yvain. He turned his gaze toward the back of the hall, where Tobias's men dragged 3 bound figures into the center of the marble
Floor.
Cedric Northcott, his shoulder bound in blood-soaked rags, fell onto his face,
Groaning.
Moira Northcott was weeping so hard she could barely draw breath, her face scarred and ruined by the rash that had eaten away her skin. And Beatrice Northcott, dragged in her torn mourning silks, looked like a drowned rat, her fingernails bleeding, her gaze darting wildly around the room.
Until it landed on me.
Lord Cedric, Cashin's voice was dangerously mild. Tell the Grand Council why. You took 3,000 silver crowns from the Dowager's purse 3 days ago. Cedric shook his head, choking on his own blood. Sire, mercy?
It
Was for the funeral rites for my daughter? For which daughter? I stepped forward, my voice cutting through Cedric's lies. Like a razor. The entire council turned their eyes upon me. To them, I was a creature pulled straight from a pauper's ditch, bare feet stained with dirt and dried blood, hair tangled, a coarse linen tunic torn at the shoulders. But my eyes were clear, dark, and utterly devoid of fear. You told the Dowager you would provide a sacrificial daughter of Northcott. Blood to be buried alive, I said, looking down at Cedric. You chose me because my mother was a foreigner from Veyra, because you thought my life was worth less than the dirt under Beatrice's shoes. And when I survived the tomb, what did you
do?
I turned toward Moira. You brought out my mother's ashes and held them over a fire.
You threatened to
scatter her into the wind if I didn't confess to being a calamity. Murmurs of disgust and shock broke out among the lords. In Stone Harbor, even the lowest peasant respected the ashes of the dead, to hold an ancestral urn hostage over a fire was an act of base desecration that even the most corrupt nobleman found repulsive. She lies. Beatrice suddenly screamed from the floor, her voice high and manic. She's a monster. My lords, don't listen to her. Everything that comes out of her mouth is a curse. She cursed my hands when she was 7, and they rotted. She cursed my mother's ribs, and a horse broke them. She's a witch who bewitched His Majesty's mind. I looked at Beatrice. For 10 years, I had shrunk beneath her sneers. For 10 years, I had hidden my hands inside my sleeves so she wouldn't see the chilblains, while she wore marten fur and silk gloves. You stole my coat, I said quietly. You took the only warm thing my mother left me and threw it into the flames. You wanted to walk into the palace on my
dead body.
I am the recognized daughter of Northcott. Beatrice shrieked, spitting blood and saliva onto the marble. I am noble. You are nothing. You are a bastard. Child born in the dirt. Then let your nobility save you, I whispered. The air in the throne room grew suddenly, impossibly cold. The tapers on the great bronze chandeliers flickered, their golden flames turning an eerie, pale
blue.
You loved your beauty more than your soul, I said, each word dropping like a lead weight into the silence of the court. You used your face to flatter murderers and your hands to burn the dead. Beatrice Northcott, may your tongue dry into ash before you ever speak another lie, and may your skin turn as black as the charcoal you fed my mother's coat to. Beatrice opened her mouth to scream a rebuttal. No sound came out. Her eyes widened in unspeakable agony. She clutched her throat with both hands, her fingernails tearing into her own neck. Before the eyes of 200 lords of the realm, a creeping, soot-black discoloration spread from the corners of her lips, creeping across her cheeks, turning her smooth, fair skin into dry, cracked charcoal. She thrashed on the floor, clawing at her tongue, which had swollen and hardened like a burnt coal in her mouth. The lords scrambled backward in terror, knocking over chairs and tripping over their own robes. Sorcery, someone yelled in the back. No. Cashin's voice boomed across the hall, drawing every eye back to the Emperor. Not sorcery, justice. Cashin stepped up the first 3 tiers of the golden throne. 10 years ago, the Emperor said, his eyes fixed on Dowager Queen Yvain. The northern march fell because grain shipments from Northcott Hall were cut with lime and sand. 5,000 Imperial soldiers starved in the snow, while Cedric Northcott built his southern pleasure gardens with the profits. Cedric groaned from the floor, his forehead pressed against the cold stone, unable to lift his head. 6 years ago, Cashin continued, taking another step, grandmother Adeline. Northcott discovered that Moira Northcott was funneling court bribes into foreign accounts. Adeline died within 3 months. The morgue records were burned, but the bones remained in the earth. The cinnabar has spoken. Moira Northcott curled into a ball, weeping silently, her hands pressed over her ruined face. And 3 days ago, Cashin reached the top tier, standing directly before the trembling queen. You, Yvain, tried to bury the crown of Stone Harbor under 3 feet of lime. Yvain stepped backward until she hit the back of the golden throne. Her pearl cage trembled so violently that several black pearls snapped their wire mountings and bounced down the marble steps. You cannot execute me, she hissed, her voice shaking with venomous pride.
My
brother commands the Eastern Fleet. My cousins hold the southern passes.
If you
touch a hair on my head, the entire kingdom burns from coast to border. Your brother was arrested at midnight in the naval yards, Tobias Vance called out from the doorway, holding up a blood-stained Admiralty seal.
The Eastern
Fleet has declared for the Emperor. Yvain's eyes darted toward the side doors, looking for an escape that was no longer there. You think you've won, Cashin? Yvain sneered, her desperation turning into a feral grin. You think you can rule this kingdom with a cursed bastard girl from the Veyra Highlands by your side? The priests will never crown her. The high houses will never bow to a calamity. Cashin turned slowly, looking back down the long hall. His eyes passed over the kneeling lords, over the ruined, groaning heaps of the Northcott family, and settled on me. I stood there, bloodied, battered, holding a clay urn against my heart. She did not bring the calamity, Cashin said, his voice echoing with absolute authority. Northcott Hall bred the rot. You fed it. The girl merely gave your sins a voice. He turned back to Tobias. Strip Cedric Northcott of his titles, his lands, and his heraldry. Seize every coin, every estate, every barn of grain. He shall be taken to the Eastern Salt mines, where he will carry rocks until his back breaks under the weight of his 3,000 crowns. Cedric let out a low, hopeless wail as the guards dragged him backward by his heels. As for Moira Northcott, Cashin continued coldly, let her be placed in the paupers cemetery, where she once dumped the innocent. She will sweep the graves of the nameless with her bare hands until the cinnabar in her own blood finishes its work. Moira was hauled away, her screams echoing down the marble corridors until the heavy iron doors cut them short. Cashin's eyes fell upon Beatrice, who was still squirming on the floor, mute, blackened and broken. Take her to the city gates, the Emperor commanded. Hang a wooden board about her neck that reads, Here lies the vanity of Northcott Hall. Let her beg for crusts from the paupers she despised. If anyone offers her a coat, let them remember the winter of her sister. The guards dragged Beatrice away, like a bundle of spoiled straw. Only Yvain remained on the high platform, trapped between the throne and the Emperor's blade. You won't take me alive to rot in an iron cell, Cashin, Yvain whispered. Her hand dropped suddenly to the velvet cushion of the throne. With a violent jerk, she pulled a concealed brass lever hidden behind the gilded lion's head. A hollow, metallic groan echoed from the foundation beneath our feet. Down, Tobias roared. The floor beneath the high dais tilted violently. From the ventilation grates around the perimeter of the room, black, oily smoke poured out in thick, choking plumes. It smelled of sulfur, dried pitch, and dead leaves, the dreaded Veyran fire pitch, an alchemical weapon banned since the Great War. If I cannot have the crown, Yvain shrieked, pulling a small silver striker from her sleeve, then Stone Harbor shall have no king. She struck the flint. A spark danced toward the oily vapor rising from the floor. Before the flame could catch the air, I dropped my mother's urn gently onto the marble flagstone behind me, and stepped forward. The air in my throat felt hot, dry, and tight. My mother had told me once, when I was 5 years old and crying over a frozen bird, "The women of Veyra do not beg the wind. We tell the wind where to blow." I had spent my entire life believing my mouth was a curse, a shameful defect that brought ruin to everyone around me. But as I looked at the woman who had poisoned an empire and tried to burn us alive, I knew what this voice was. It was not a curse. It was the judgment the gods were too slow to deliver. "Let no spark catch," I spoke into the rising smoke.
My voice did not sound like my own.
It sounded like the crack of glacial ice on the high peaks of Veyra, deep, resonant, and ancient. "Let the fire turn to water, and let the breath leave the chest of the murderer." The spark leaving Yvain's silver striker did not flare into an explosion. The moment my words washed over the dais, the spark died with a tiny, pathetic
fizz.
The black smoke pouring from the grate suddenly curdled, turning into a heavy, cold white mist that smelled of fresh mountain snow. Yvain stared at her striker in disbelief. She struck it again.
And again.
Only cold water dripped from the steel wheel. Then she gasped. Her hands flew to her throat. Her eyes bulged as if an invisible iron hand had closed around her windpipe. She staggered forward, tumbling down the 3 golden steps, her elaborate pearl cage breaking apart completely as she crashed onto the stone floor at Cashin's feet. She clawed at the air, her lungs refusing to take in a single drop of oxygen, until her thrashing slowed, her fingers went limp, and her eyes rolled back into the dark. The throne room fell into dead silence once more. The white mist settled slowly across the marble floor, pooling like winter snow around the boots of the emperor. Cashin lowered his sword. He didn't look at the dead queen at his feet.
He
stepped over her body and walked down the steps until he stood directly in front of me. He looked at my bleeding feet, my torn tunic, and the clay urn resting safely against the marble pillar behind me. Then, before the 200 surviving lords of Stone Harbor, the Iron Emperor of the North dropped to one knee. 3 days later, Northcott Hall was no more. By Imperial decree, the great manor on the western cliffs was stripped of its gilded cornices, its rosewood paneling, and its high iron gates. The granaries, filled with grain stolen from the northern marches, were thrown open to the paupers of the lower city. A line of 3,000 ragged men, women, and children walked through the courtyard, carrying away sacks of wheat, dried salted fish, and winter blankets. I stood on the carriage road overlooking the valley, wearing a warm coat of heavy gray wool lined with silver fox fur, a coat Cashin had ordered tailored for me by the palace seamstresses, with deep pockets and iron-stitched seams that no fire could easily burn. Beside me, Tobias Vance leaned against his warhorse, watching the smoke rise. From the courtyard below, the ancestral shrine of the Northcotts had been pulled down stone by stone, its memorial tablets ground into gravel to pave the public wagon road. "His Majesty wanted to know if you wished to keep the land," Tobias said quietly. "No," I replied, feeling the clean winter wind whip across my face. "The earth here has swallowed too many lies. Let the grass grow over it. In 10 years, let no one remember that a Northcott ever stood here." Down in the ditch beside the public road, a figure wrapped in burlap rags was crawling through the mud. It was Beatrice. Her face was black and scarred, her tongue ruined, her fine hands now raw and bleeding from digging roots out of the frozen earth. When a passing grain wagon rattled past, a sack of coarse oats spilled a handful of grain into the dirt. Beatrice lunged forward on all fours, fighting a stray dog for the raw, muddy oats. She looked up and saw me standing on the hillside. For a moment, our eyes met. There was no hatred left in her eyes, only the dull, hollow terror of a beast that had forgotten it was ever human. She remembered the warmth of the hearth she had stolen, the coats she had burned, and the sister she had tried to bury
alive.
I did not curse her. I did not need to. Her life was already the cage she had built with her own hands. I turned my back on her and walked toward the waiting carriage. The Imperial carriage did not head south toward the warmth of the sunburst
Palace.
It turned north toward the great northern pass, where the jagged peaks of the Veyra Highlands rose into the gray clouds like the teeth of a sleeping dragon. Inside the carriage, a charcoal brazier burned steadily, keeping the air warm with the clean scent of cedarwood.
Cashin sat opposite me.
He had laid aside his battle armor, wearing a simple traveling cloak of dark wool, though his eyes remained as sharp and vigilant as ever. On the seat beside me rested the clay urn, wrapped in a square of deep blue silk. "The council wanted me to offer you an estate in the capital," Cashin said, his voice quiet over the rumble of the iron-rimmed wheels. "A title, a palace with 30 servants and a seat at the grand assemblies." I laughed softly. A palace full of courtiers waiting for me to open my mouth and bring down a ceiling?
No, Your Majesty.
I've had enough of gilded cages. Cashin looked at me, a faint, rare smile touching the corner of his lips.
You
Saved my life twice, Ilera. Once in the tomb, and once in the throne room.
And
Emperor does not leave his debts unpaid. You already paid me, I said, looking out the window as the first flakes of northern snow began to drift across the pine forests. You pulled me out of Northcott Hall. You let me watch them fall. And you gave me an escort to the border. That was not payment, Cashin replied, leaning forward slightly. That was clearing the board. He reached into his tunic and pulled out the other half of the crest-marked medallion he had pressed into my hand inside the sarcophagus. He held it out on his open palm. "The bloodline of Veyra was never cursed, Ilera," he said. 300 years ago, before the Thornfields united the lowlands, the Veyran priestesses were the wardens of truth. Their words held power because they spoke without deceit.
When
Your mother came to Stone Harbor, your father thought she was a simple foreigner. He didn't know he had married the daughter of the High Clan. I looked down at the medallion. The two halves clicked together perfectly, forming the image of an eagle perched atop a frozen mountain. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because the kingdom needs a warden," Cashin said, his dark eyes meeting mine, with an intensity that made the cold outside seem distant. "A court built on flattery and poison will always rot from the inside. I don't need courtiers who tell me what I wish to hear. I need someone whose voice can cut through lies, like an iron blade. And if I speak," I murmured, "and the world breaks around us? Then let it break," Cashin answered without hesitation. "We will build a better one from the stones." We reached the summit of the Whispering Pass at sunrise. The wind here did not carry the stench of sea salt, old lime, or burning silk. It was cold, pure, and fierce, smelling of pine needles, high glaciers, and wild
time.
Below us, the valleys of Veyra stretched out in endless waves of silver. Mist, green meadows, and crystal rivers rushing down to the northern lakes. I stepped down from the carriage onto the crisp, untouched snow. Cashin walked 3 paces behind me, his hand resting on his sword belt, keeping the guards back at the tree line to give me space. I walked to the edge of the high cliff, where a solitary ancient pine clung to the rock face, its branches heavy with frost. I took the blue silk cloth from the clay urn. With steady hands, I loosened the simple wooden stopper. "Mother," I whispered into the wind. The wind did not howl or push me back. It caught the edges of my gray cloak, lifting my hair away from my face like the gentle touch of a hand. "I took you out of that dark house," I said, feeling no tears, only a deep, clean peace settling into my ribs. "I took you away from the lime pits, the false tears, and the cold stone altars. You're home now." I tilted the urn into the northern breeze. The fine, gray ashes caught the morning light, turning to gold and silver as they scattered across the great abyss. They did not fall to the rocks below. The high mountain draft caught them, lifting them up into the sunlit clouds, carrying them across the valleys and the blue peaks of the Veyra Highlands where she had run as a girl. I stood there until the urn was empty. When I turned around, Cashin was waiting for me. He didn't offer a hand to help me over the snow. He knew I did not need to be
Carried.
He simply stood there, an emperor who had walked out of a grave, waiting for the girl whose words had shattered an empire. "Where do we go now, Your Majesty?" I asked, setting the empty clay jar at the roots of the ancient pine. Cashin looked back toward the south, where the road wound down toward the capital, and then looked at me. "Back to Stone Harbor," he said, the ghost of a smile in his dark eyes. "We have a kingdom to clean." I walked across the snow and fell into step beside him. The girl with the cursed mouth was dead, buried in the dark of Hollow Crest, mausoleum beneath 3,000 crowns of greed. The woman who walked down the mountain carried no curses, only the truth, cold as iron, sharp as winter, and loud enough to make kings tremble.